Working for you. A weekly talk radio program which highlights developments of national interest and the activities of your St. Kitts Nevis government. Join host Lesroy Williams as he presents news, views, reports, and interviews about everything regarding the activities of the Team Unity government and the building of our communities and the development of St. Kitts Nevis. Tune in and call in to interact with your government and share your views regarding the upward forward development of your community and our beautiful Twin Island Federation. Working for You is weekly, every Wednesday live from 1:30 p.m. to 3 p.m. on ZIZ Radio, Win FM, and Sugar City FM with rebroadcast on participating stations. Working for You.
Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Working for You. This weekly radio program is where the people of St. Kitts and Nevis gets the opportunity to interact with their government. The Team Unity government is for the people and by the people. I am Jamiela McPhail, sitting in for Lesroy Williams, who is on assignment today. As a woman, I am honored today to be the host of the show because our guest today is an amazing leader on our island. She is smart, articulate, tough, and she cares about the people of St. Kitts and Nevis. She was appointed senator by Prime Minister Dr. the Honorable Timothy Harris. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me to welcome the Honorable Minister, Senator Wendy Phipps, Minister of State in the Ministries of Health, Gender Affairs and Social Development.
Well, first of all, Jamila, I wanted to say thank you to ZIZ and to SKNIS for allowing me this opportunity to share the government's initiatives and its vision as it relates to the portfolios for which I'm responsible. And just by way of correction, I'm directly responsible for health, social services, gender affairs, and community development. Okay. So it's actually part of what is considered the largest portfolio in the cabinet, and it is for that reason why this ministry would have two ministers, a senior and a junior minister. I'm particularly honored to be here, not just to share with the people of St. Kitts and Nevis the vision of the government as it relates to the portfolios for which I have responsibility, but also from the standpoint of basically sending the message about what women can do in the Federation. There are persons who will look at the composition of the cabinet and figure, well, there's only one female in there. So is it a case of affirmative action or is it a case of tokenism? And I don't think either would be an accurate description. I think by definition, what we should be moving towards as governments, both regionally, locally, and by extension internationally, is to have greater representation of women in all facets of development, including leadership from the top. The data shows us that the world over, women lead in so many areas. Apart from voter turnout, which we constitute the largest demographic for, it's also evident that women also constitute, by and large, the largest membership in churches, and also within the workforce, both the civilian workforce as well as outside of that, meaning the private sector workforce. And in the case of St. Kitts and Nevis, most of our families, at least 50% of them, are families that are headed by females, and in most cases they're single parent households. So by extension, the representation within the cabinet is really meant to advocate for and to lobby for the plans and programs that will be designed to assist those women given the challenges that are contingent with raising a family, perhaps juggling family and career. So for that, I am honored. So I will be happy to share with you and your guests some of the initiatives that we have going forward as it relates to the entire ministry portfolio.
Interesting, and you had an important introduction because a lot of those issues that you raised, we plan on speaking about this afternoon. So before we get started though, I want to congratulate you on Team Unity, well, you and Team Unity for the great news in the recent poll conducted by a well-known pollster, Don Anderson, which shows that the Prime Minister Prime Minister Harris, his government, the Team Unity government, has overwhelming support from the people of St. Kitts and Nevis. Over 2/3 of the people support this government. So congratulations on that.
I thank you for the commendation, but I think that if you set out to run a political campaign and by extension a government where you say it is people-centered, you would expect that when the time comes to start calibrating the level of responsiveness and following through on the mandate that you would have been given based on the election promises you made, we would hope that that type of rating is what is evident, because you are there to represent the interests of people by and large. And for us, it's not about politics, it is about meeting the needs of people. Yes, it is true that the Team Unity construct is a novelty as it relates to the St. Kitts and Nevis political culture by virtue of 3 existing parties forming an alliance, a strategic alliance, to bring to the people of Nevis and St. Kitts the type of government that we believe they deserve. It's a government of inclusion. It is a government that speaks towards opportunity. It is a government that speaks towards a national concerted effort at bringing synergies as you confront together the challenges that we face nationally, regionally, and internationally. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, regardless of the political constructs and systems that we would have here in St. Kitts and Nevis, the fact still remains that St. Kitts and Nevis is the smallest member of the OECS, by extension the smallest member of the CARICOM member states, and the smallest country within the Western Hemisphere. And we do not get any special breaks for being small. Our vote is 1 vote at the UN, just like the US, and all of the other G7 countries will have 1 vote. So by extension, we have a big responsibility to the rank and file of the people of St. Kitts and Nevis to do everything in our power to represent their interests. And that representation is not marked by party colors. So I would hope that as we continue to carry out the mandate that we have been given following the elections in February, that that type of rating will continue to grow, and that it will be demonstrative of a government that is governing by responsiveness and by initiative and by the inclusion of people. Because at the end of the day, it's a common result and a common success story that we would like to have, and show St. Kitts and Nevis to the rest of the world as a model that can be followed. Granted, as I said, the political construct of Team Unity is such that it shifts the paradigm politically in St. Kitts and Nevis, and by extension the region, because it is the type of thing that has not been tried before. Yes, you've had 2-party coalitions, but not of the type that which we have developed and which we hope to use to change the political culture and change the whole approach to development of people and of the country. So for that, we are thankful for the rating that we have received, but what we would like to see is continued sustenance in terms of that level of approval rating and responsiveness.
Fantastic. Now, Minister, as has been the tradition with working for you, the host is accustomed of asking all the ministers, including the Prime Minister, how the first 9 months in office has been. So what has been your experience?
My experience has been multifaceted. Multifaceted for several reasons. One, because I came out of the private sector. My entire background, for the most part, has been private sector driven. And after having ran a private sector development agency for 16.5 years, and then immediately thereafter starting my own business as a business advocacy and support services consultant, it was a bit of a culture shock for me to come back into the public sector, because my career after leaving school began in the public sector as a teacher at Bastia High School. And then when I would have returned from college after graduate school, I had a very short stint at the Ministry of Tourism as an interim public relations manager. But then the rank and file of my career would have been categorized by private sector involvement and advocacy. So the culture change is a bit different because the work ethic is different. I think based on my private sector experience, I would have had a situation where the clients with whom I would have interacted and the membership base that I would have been advocating on behalf of would have been approaching issues to do with workplace performance, productivity, and so forth from the standpoint of results, from the standpoint of merit, And the public sector is a departure from that, even though I very well see, based on what we have articulated as a party and as a government now, of having more of a public sector transformation policy based on meritocracy, but not necessarily based on the traditional system of people operating in the public sector as if it's an entitlement. Okay, I've worked so many years, I am due this increment this year. So what we really would like to see, and that is where the culture shift has begun to become evident, is that we want to run a public sector that recognizes that because we are small, because we are challenged, because we have a relatively smaller labor force than most islands, we have to make sure that at the same time the national competitiveness of St. Kitts and Nevis is largely characterized by the quality of our workforce in the public as well as in the private sector. And the best way for us to do that is to set targets and set standards in terms of performance and productivity. What this means is that not only will you be entering into the job market having, for want of a better term, signed a contract with your government as your employer, that you bring your skills, your services and your talent to the workplace, and in exchange for that you get paid. It's not about showing up between 8 to 4, and it doesn't matter if you perform or not, or if you watch the clock from 8 to 4, or if you have your bag over your shoulders by 4:15. It's about showing results. It's about performance. It's about going the extra step. So that at the end of the day, when persons are promoted, they're promoted with the confidence that they have earned it, and that there is trust that you would have embedded in that individual to be able to make an educated decision and say, this individual is worthy of promotion because I see leadership acumen inside of this individual, or I see their ability to think on their feet, or to get people to work as a team, or to not be threatened if other persons come in the workforce who perhaps might be more educated than you, or may have more experience than you. And there are certain countries that we can look to as examples that we can follow in terms of the paradigm shift that we're hoping to get towards that type of productivity for national development. One such country I often refer to is Singapore. Singapore has an island economy that is very similar to ours, has come out of a similar sugar past like us, just like other small countries, relatively speaking, like Mauritius. And what Singapore has been able to do over the past 50 or 60 years is to do the type of economic transformation that started in the mindset of the people who work there, where they understand what their role is. So it's not just a matter of you thinking, well, it doesn't matter if I perform because I only sweep the drain. It doesn't matter if I give results because I'm only an orderly at the hospital, or I'm only teaching in the government school system and they don't like to pay teachers much money, so I will just be on a go slow, operate on automatic control or autopilot, and figure that's the end of it. They are able to bridge that divide among the Singaporean psyche that this is my role, but this is where I fit into the bigger picture. And Singapore has shown the results of the investment in that shift over time, where consistently they're rated number 1 by the World Bank's doing business ratings in terms of service, in terms of national productivity, in terms of output, in terms of impact in the rest of the world, to the point where they have now become a creature of their own success because they do not have enough workforce to power the industries that they have now, to the point where the labor force itself has become a separate business, where you boat in or ferry in people on a daily basis from the Malaysian territories to work in your workforce. And that says a lot. And that is the kind of future that I think that we have the potential to develop in St. Kitts and Nevis, but it has to start at the individual level. So that, I would say, would be the biggest facet of my adjustment in government life. The other point that has been amazing to me has been the approach of the electorate, or I should say some of the electorate, towards in terms of the demands that they expect of public officials. Because, and it varies too, because when you look at the history of St. Kitts and Nevis, I guess because one came out of a peasantry system after emancipation, and the other one was a system wherein the crown owned all of the land, you found that just like Anguilla, of which we were part as a trinity, and Nevis, the attitude was always different, because these are people who were landed, they had title to land, they had title to property. These are people who were self-employed, they were industrious, and the reliance factor on government was not that prominent. But the history of St. Kitts now, as the other partner in the equation, has been different, where it was a case that the Crown owned all of the land, or most of the land. So you either work for the Crown, as in our case, in the 400-year-old history that we had in terms of the sugar industry, and even post-World War II, when there was the beginning of a private sector in St. Kitts and Nevis, most of those businesses were serving the needs of the sugar industry. So either way, you were still strapped into this agrarian mindset where there was a dependency on the Crown for your employment, for your development, for the things that you would require as a people. And that is the kind of shift that we need to see that we move away from, so that people become more self-reliant and people understand that yes, government is there to meet your needs through the social programs that we provide, to the opportunities for investment, opportunities for entrepreneurship, because that is another paradigm shift that we want to see as a team unity government, where we teach our young people to not just go through the school system by robotics and then figure, well, okay, I am going to school from kindergarten right up to CFB, I get my CAPE subjects, and then I go off to college, and then somebody has to provide me with a job. It's about what can you do, what kind of innovation can you bring to bear, what kind of untapped sectors do we have in St. Kitts and Nevis that you, through your own initiative and ingenuity and innovation, can say, well, look, this is a niche area in St. Kitts and Nevis that's not been met, and maybe rather than expecting to find a job, perhaps I can create my own opportunity, and by extension I create other jobs. Of course, when we get into the whole topic of entrepreneurship, it prevents some very controversial arguments, because for some young people it might mean going on to college, probably doing an MBA if you get that far, or deciding to forego college because your business idea came so early that you don't see the need to go to a traditional bricks and mortar college to get a 4-year degree. And then there are so many best cases examples that we have internationally that might support that, like the Bill Gates story, and so many other people, or Sam Walton, as is the case of the Walmart brand. These are people who neither, well, in one case of Bill Gates, he dropped out. In the case of Sam Walton, I don't think it was an opportunity he had, because he worked in a particular business and then he decided, why can't I do this for myself? And now Walmart is the biggest retail chain globally. Just like how everybody knows the Bill Gates name, or you happen to own an Apple product or know somebody who owns an Apple product. So that is the kind of example that I think that we should be having more of, and some of it is happening. Some of it has been facilitated by government, perhaps, for example, through the passage of the small business legislation in November 2009 for small business development, and there are certain provisions and fiscal incentives that are designed to assist startup business persons in terms of getting their act together in terms of plant and equipment, machinery, that type of stuff, as well as the business support services provided by agencies like NED, the National Entrepreneurial Development Division that is housed within the Ministry of Trade, to provide that type of hand-holding experience to the budding entrepreneur. Things like perhaps bookkeeping, hiring of staff, succession planning. What happens if your business goes enough to the point where you want to take it public? By that I mean being publicly traded on the ECSC or some other stock exchange to raise capital. These are some of the things that we as a country need to build on. And of course, we have strategic partners when it comes to foreign affairs and diplomacy that we can lean on, who have best case examples in that too, best practices that we can use. One such country is Taiwan, who happens to be the very first country that this country developed diplomatic relations with immediately after independence. Because with Taiwan, because of the investments they have made in entrepreneurship, you have found that there's so many global brands now coming out of Taiwan from that incubator type small business approach that you can't believe started in somebody's kitchen or somebody's garage. Some examples that we might not even think of coming out of Taiwan that started as micro businesses includes BenQ, which is one of the electronic producers that makes things like LCD projectors. They also make other small audiovisual type equipment. Then there's Acer Computers. For a moment, you will never think that these are companies that started at the very micro level, where somebody let them share space in a business incubator. The space might be just 5 feet by 8 feet, but that's where they started. And they had the support infrastructure, including the financing, such as venture capital funding backed by the government and other private sector stakeholders that now make them the household names that they are. So that is another part of the shift that we would like to see in terms of entrepreneurship and getting away from a dependency mindset where we are teaching, as they say, our people how to fish. Okay, not just taking fish and carrying it to them. So that is another paradigm shift that I would like to see, and I guess I expect it to happen because of the private sector culture from which I have emerged. And then the other part is just benchmarking yourself against world leading nations as well to see how are we doing. Because every now and again we need to take stock and say, well, these are our indices as a nation when it comes to things like literacy, when it comes to things like healthcare, mortality rates, and so forth, so that you could benchmark against the best in the world. Because St. Kitts and Nevis people are not worse than anybody else. We could compete with the best. And ambassadors such as the O'Kim Collins story tell us that we could compete against the best, as small as we are, and still become household names. So it's more of that I think we need to see, and these are the kind of things that I found has characterized the first 9 months for me in terms of where I would like us to go and where we need to change mindsets in terms of getting people to see their true potential.
Fantastic, and it's clear from what you have just said that the government, the Team Unity government, is one that has vision. Now, this week is Child Abuse Awareness Week.
That is correct.
And as a mother, this is a topic that is very important to me. I love my child more than anything else in this world, and it grieves my heart to see children suffering in any way or any form. What are some of the things that your ministry is doing to prevent child abuse?
Issues such as child abuse are dealt with the arm of the ministry that is focused on social services and community development, specifically the child probation department. That is something that is led by the director, Ms. Deborah Matthew, with the support of other sectors within the ministry, such as counseling and so forth. And what we have found is that child abuse is not new. It has been around from when God made the world. Okay, where people use their children for strategic reasons, because their children are, for want of a better term, supposed to be the agent through which they live vicariously, especially for some of those parents who may be perceived as, in their own minds, as underachievers, where they tell themselves, well, I didn't get to accomplish X, so therefore my child has to be this. And it is for that reasons I find, well, I am not a parent, so I cannot claim to judge parents insofar as that debate is concerned. But based on the years that I have spent teaching in the public school system, we have had to interact with parents. I begin to see some of how they think and where they're coming from. And sometimes you find that children often become the subject of abuse because parents who lacked opportunities, that they now see their children as vehicles for getting them to that point, basically want to decide ahead of time that that child is supposed to be a doctor and this child is supposed to be a lawyer, when actually you're really denying that child the creative direction that God gave him or her. Because I would assume that the better approach would be to find out what your child's talents are. Your child might not be academically gifted like Sally, who is sitting next to him in school, but then maybe that's a different plan for Sally's life. But then your child might be the next Bill Gates, the next child that comes out with an app or maybe a cure for cancer that happens just by serendipity and by using everyday medication, or everyday plants and herbs that we don't think about. And I think we run the risk of abusing children when we figure these children are not living up to the expectations that you have for them. But what about what the child wants? And that is why I think we need to get to a point in our school system where we begin to tell our educators and our parents, especially knowing a lot of them are young, inexperienced parents or accidental parents, because they go to have sex and getting pregnant is not something to think about at the time. It happens. And in cases like that, you find that there are stronger correlations between that type of situation and the child abuse part of it, because now you realize that this child is not a doll. You got to look after this child, and this child means no more social life on the strip. It means sacrificing for yourself, where you thought you would get your hair, your nails, and your makeup done every weekend. You know, can't have that, especially if you choose to get pregnant for a renegade father who is not around because he's busy going out with other women. So now this child becomes your burden or your albatross, and you lash out at this child, and the child didn't ask to be here. None of us asked to be here. And these are where we find some of the problems. So the point I started making is that perhaps we need to, from the time children enter this preschool system, we need to begin mapping to see where their skills are, and begin to have early conversations with them in terms of how they think and how they see themselves. Find out which things they're good at. And as you process through the education system, you find ways that you can channel those talents as raw as they are, so that you could figure out where their gifting is, and that you could help them make better decisions when it comes to choosing subjects in schools, and at the same time figuring which children are more geared towards technical and vocational education, which children are more artistically inclined, and which children you can say need to be the ones in the labs looking down the test tube and in the petri dishes to come up with cures for cancer, to come up with all kinds of new innovations in terms of finding ways to confront the challenges that human beings have. And I think that would improve us a lot better. What our ministry has chosen to do, there's a project that we have called MEND, and it is really meant to mold, to educate parents, basically to inspire them, and to give them some sort of direction in terms of their parenting. And with that program, well, there are about 25 families we have in it right now, so you monitor these families all the time. They have the benefit of counseling, they have the benefit of guidance, and you help them through that process. Some of them are also financially challenged, so the government has a voucher system for groceries that assists them in that regard. More than likely, some of those families would be assigned a probation officer to look at these children, especially those that are pubescent or pre-adolescent and so forth, because you know at that time is when they start challenging the authority of adults. The hormones are raging, they're watching what's going on in the international media, and they're following peer pressure. So we have that program in place, but there is also there are also other programs that we run to try to keep an eye on what is going on, and a lot of it comes from partnership with the schools too, because we expect the teachers to be attuned to looking for the signs of behavior change in children. Do you have a child in school, for example, who is like in grade 4, and that child was doing well in class, and then all of a sudden the child comes to school one morning and has crawled into a shell? If you speak to the child, he or she jumps out of the chair. If they're around certain persons of a particular gender, they freeze. These are the signs that you look for, because the problem is that the data internationally is showing us that most instances of child abuse take place by perpetrators who are well known to the family. And very often they threaten children and say, don't you dare say anything, otherwise I kill you, or kill your mother, kill your family. And in some cases, regrettably, the mothers very well know that their children are being abused, but some of them end up prostituting their own kids because they find themselves in a situation of economic dependence. And they tell themselves, well, this man has moved on from me, who is old hat now, and has started in on my teenage daughter, but I can't say anything because if he leaves, we can't eat. So basically, what have you sold out your child's purity and virginity for? Money? Forgetting that you leave that child scarred with an arrested development, and then they themselves basically fumble through their adolescent years, and then repeats itself in terms of cycle. That they too now realize they have no options, or so they think, and they end up getting pregnant for somebody because they're looking for love in the wrong places, or they want to get out of the mother's house because they're tired of the situation. And then we also confront those cases where reports have been made, where the schools have done their work in terms of being vigilant for the signs of child abuse. Cases come up, the special victims unit in the police force deals with it, and before the trial could come up, somebody has paid off the mother. So how much is your child's purity worth? Okay, $30,000, $10,000. So you have the social services staff standing up outside the court waiting for their turn to go in, only to look like fools because some parent has cut their own deal with somebody else to keep a pedophile out of prison. So there are those situations. So basically we still have a lot of work to do in that regard, but we wanted through the Awareness Week to shed light on the issue of child abuse because it happens in cycles. And what we also have seen from all of the international data that has been done is that persons who were themselves abused are often the ones who become the abuser because they do the same thing to other people's children, mete out violence, mete out fear, and you wreck lives. You know, and we have had cases here in St. Kitts and Nevis that are so gross and so atrocious to the point where several years ago, one of our OBGYNs had to perform a hysterectomy on a 2-year-old child. Because how do you as a grown man expect that you could get turned on so much by a 2-year-old child that you mash up the insides of this child? And I don't mean to be so gross in terms of our listening and viewing audience, but I am the type of individual who likes to keep it real because that is exactly what it is. So you have a little child who has had to have her uterus removed, and she's going to progress through puberty with an arrested puberty because she may have ovaries in place. Everything might have been taken out for all we know, and she has development that would take her into adolescence that has been arrested, and all of her other little female peers, they have their body shaping up nicely and they have breasts and so forth, and then over time you have to raise your child with the knowledge that this has happened to you and you're damaged goods.
You're scared for life.
Of course you're scared for life, and any intention that that young woman had of having children naturally has gone, and the perpetrator has taken that away from her. So we have cases like that, and as I said, it's gross, it's atrocious, but these are the things that we need to bring an end to. And it goes the other way too. For example, even though this is not a case of child abuse, I don't know if you would have been following the news out of St. Lucia within the last 5 days, where Kenny Anthony himself as the Prime Minister had to go on national radio and TV and speak about a violent attack on a 97-year-old woman in St. Lucia. You know, now who in their right mind will do that? Because that woman could be your mother. She could be your grandmother. Don't you have sisters? Don't you have mothers? Would you want somebody to do that to them? And then to get an assault like that visited upon you in such violence will probably hasten your death because she's nearly 100. She'll never be the same again after that. You know, but then that tells me that more than likely the individual who did that to that 97-year-old woman may be somebody who has had a history of abusing people and by extension abusing women, and he might have started very early and had gotten away with it for a very, very long time. So these are some of the issues we want to shed light on. Now, one of the things that we have done this year for Child Abuse Awareness Week is to schedule some luncheon dates with some of the children in the primary schools. So, for example, on Friday, several government officials, including ministers, would be taking 2 children per school to lunch with an adult, perhaps one of their teachers, so that you can begin to show some of these children, show them the fact that they have role models that they can look up to, but most importantly, to let them know that they matter. Because very often we tend to feel traditionally as we've raised children that they should be seen and not heard. They shouldn't say anything, they don't have an opinion, but they do have an opinion. And perhaps sometimes if we listen to children more, the mistakes we make as adults, we wouldn't make them. Because they see things through eyes that are not clouded by a thing yet. And they see things as they are, and they call things as they are. And it is not our job to shoot them down or to decide, well, you need to shut up because nobody asked you anything. And that whole approach to us taking them to lunch is to tell them that they're important and that they have a listening ear and that they have advocates in government who will be there to support them. So we're hoping that all of that continues throughout the rest of the week and even beyond, so that, as I say, we really begin to show our nation's children that there are people out there advocating for them, even if your parent is not doing it.
Minister, let's talk a little bit about health. Now, you served as the chair of CAFA, the Caribbean Public Health Agency. You understand firsthand surrounding health issues in St. Kitts and Nevis. What are the most dangerous threats to the people of St. Kitts and Nevis as it relates to health, and what are you doing locally and regionally to address these threats?
Okay, well, before I answer those questions, let me just put in context what CAFA is. CAFA is an acronym for the Caribbean Public Health Agency, and it is really the merger of 5 individual agencies within CARICOM that had their own discrete approach to managing healthcare. The largest of those 5 agencies is what we in the health system, if you follow the health system for years, would have known as CAREC, which is the Caribbean Epidemiological Center. That is the center in the region. Well, it still functions as that since the merger, but CAREC would be that agency that you would go to get confirmation when there's an outbreak of disease, so that at the first sign of the presentation of that malady, you would be able to have it verified beyond a shadow of a doubt. So, for example, when chikungunya came around over a year ago, CAREC would have done a lot of groundbreaking work in that, even though they didn't have the budget for it, but they had to, because that's the CARICOM's version of the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, as it relates to the U.S. context. So I became the chairperson of CAFA in March of this year, shortly after the government took office. And of course, the biggest challenge confronting CAFA, and by extension the member states of CARICOM, is the whole threat towards NCDs, or what we call non-communicable diseases. These include cancer, it includes diabetes, cardiac or hypertensive issues, and of course other related non-communicable type diseases. And what we are realizing is that NCDs are responsible for our greatest rate of death in St. Kitts, and also morbidity, because we have too many people in this small population of 50,000 who are presenting with cancer, with diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and most of these are interrelated, because very often when you have somebody who is morbidly obese, that person more than likely is a case waiting to happen for diabetes, especially type 2 diabetes, which is adult onset diabetes that really does not present itself until you get up into your 30s or 40s. And then those are the types of individuals who also end up with cardiac issues, starting with hypertension, because the bigger you get, the more pressure you put on your heart to pump blood to all parts of it, and it puts more pressure on it. Okay, because remember, the heart is a muscle. So the bigger you are, the more work you put on it in terms of meeting that need for oxygenated blood all the time to feed your brain and all of your other organs. So what we are finding is that by extension, we also have increased cases of amputations as it relates to the issue of diabetes, especially for persons who are either in denial about their diabetes or having been diagnosed accurately as being diabetic. They refuse to follow medication and follow the regimen that the healthcare providers have given them. So what you find sometimes is that they don't pay attention to things like peripheral care, like especially foot care. So if they're not careful, they might go out barefoot, step on a nail, ignore it, and then very soon you've realized that gangrene has set in. So when you hear of cases where people go to JNF or to Alexandria in Nevis and they have toes removed, a foot removed, an entire leg removed, it's a case of diabetes that has gotten out of control. And the amputation is really your last resort to make sure you save that person's life, and you hope that by extension positive behavior changes will take place so that they could continue to live a reasonably productive life once they have been fitted with prosthesis and so forth. So it is something that we are challenged with here in St. Kitts and Nevis too, and it is for that reason why the health administration, and in particular our health promotion unit, spends a lot of time and finances and energy into bringing that type of programming to bear and advocating for better self-monitoring, better glucose testing, and regular checks for your blood pressure, to make sure that you begin to look at these things so that it just doesn't happen to you when you happen to have a stroke or a heart attack, that something was going wrong. It's better that you have your annual physical, get it done every year, and keep getting checked. We have several health centers around St. Kitts. There are at least 11 of them. In Nevis we have about 5. You're free to show up at any of these health centers. You're free to go to the outpatient department at both hospitals and also Mary Charles in the case of St. Kitts, and get these basic testing done. so that you can begin to look at those issues. And while you're there, you could also get your hemoglobin scanned at the same time, because some people might only know at that time if they have a blood deficiency, if they're anemic. We would hope by then, if they happen to have sickle cell disease, they would have known already. But the blood test will help to bring a lot of these things out. So essentially, that is the biggest threat for CAFA. Yes, we have new threats now that we have had evidence of Zika virus showing up in some CARICOM member states. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, there are a couple tests that would have gone off from here to CAFA to verify that. And essentially, it's a similar condition carried by the Aedes aegypti mosquito, the same mosquito that transmits yellow fever, as well as the whole chikungunya illness that still is confronting us as a region. And we have to basically do everything in our power to make sure that we cut down on mosquito breeding by making sure that you don't have empty containers or old tires or other receptacles that hold water that is just stagnant, so that you treat it that way. Of course, we have other interventions such as the use of fogging through the public health department, especially the environmental health workers, where we try to do those control measures. There are other things you can do in your homes too. For example, putting in screens if you could afford it, or at least buying a mosquito net. You could also use vaporizers in your homes, like the bug mat and so forth, to help cut down on the likelihood of being bitten, because you don't know which mosquito is an infected mosquito. You can't just watch it and see. And for persons who are hearing impaired, you don't get to hear this mosquito coming, even though there's the scientific evidence is there to suggest that it is the male mosquitoes that make the most lies. The women are the silent killers. Okay? So, but there's a lot that we could be doing in terms of our own individual response mechanism to safeguarding our own health, starting from inside of our homes and what we teach children to do. Even simple things like watering plants and having water sitting in the saucers under the pots. These are things you got to stop, because anywhere, even a teaspoon of water could be a breeding ground for a mosquito to just lay the egg right there, and then if you leave it unattended, it hatches over time. So, but that essentially what constitutes the mandate of CAFA, and its membership is made up of the various ministries of health throughout the Caribbean. We do have international partners such as PAHO and the WHO, the World Health Organization, and we have other strategic partners, especially research laboratories, partner agencies in South America that are like-minded. And of course, our biggest challenge is really financing, because the needs of the region continue to grow. But with that, we are also doing our best to see how well we can respond to the needs within the resource base that has been allocated to us.
You are also the Minister of Gender Affairs, and although we touched on some of the inequalities before, I want to talk a little bit more about that. What does the Team Unity government have in store specifically for women?
Well, before I answer that question, I need to clarify what we mean when we say gender. I think traditionally we have assumed that when we talk about gender, about things to do with the advancement of women. That might be how the gender movement began within the government, going back to the early 1980s, because if my memory is correct, the very first time we had a Ministry of Women's Affairs was when our now ambassador, Constance Mitchum, headed the Ministry of Health. That's where we had a first Women's Affairs Department. And gender in that context, coming out of global conferences later on in Beijing and so forth, were basically centered around the whole issue of the advancement of women, especially when we bear in mind the statistic that I gave you earlier about more than 50% of our households being headed by women, especially single-parent women. And what we have found over time is that it really is a gender bias that we have created by assuming that when we design programs around what we call gender, that we mean women. Because the reality exists now in the prison culture that we have, in terms of the serious crime that we have in St. Kitts and Nevis, specifically homicides, that is young men visiting this violence on other young men. The prisons are overcrowded. I am sure you have less than 10 women in prison right now. The bulk of them are men, and young men probably between the ages of, let's say, maybe 18 to 45. And what we are finding is that by extension, because of the fact that these women are heading households with or without the support of men, is that the male influence is missing. So you find that they try as best as they could to rein in the kids and bring them up in a right way. But then there's some people who will tell you that it's all well and good to have a woman head in a household, but it takes a man to raise a male child. And to a certain extent, I agree with that. That doesn't mean that we have not had successful examples of men who grew up without a father figure who have become great leaders, because we have. But then I could almost guarantee you that to fill the void left by the father not being around, some other man had to step up to the plate and provide that male influence for that child, whether it's the mother's brother, the pastor for your church, a school teacher, or some other respected individual. So what we are realizing now is that our gender programs have to be balanced along gender lines. You have to have programs for women and programs for men. And by that extension, our Director of Gender Affairs, who is Miss Celia Christopher, has designed an entire week of activities that we've started a few days ago. Tomorrow I think there's a symposium at Ocean Terrace Inn where we're bringing in a speaker to speak to predominantly men who we're trying to reach out to. And of course, a lot of the good ground that we find for reaching out to our male folk would come from construction sites, especially because of the fact that most of the workers are men. You know, in terms of telling them what they could be doing to look after themselves from the standpoint of health. What could they be doing in terms of improving themselves academically and otherwise, because there's potential in everybody. So I think that is a shift that we need to see more of, to get men standing up more. You father children, you be there for them. But then at the same time, they need to know what it is to father a child, because you don't expect them to learn it by osmosis, especially if they never had a male role model around.
Correct.
Okay, so these are some of the things that we look at. What we would like to see is if we change the statistic to, in terms of having more families defined within a marriage situation. That doesn't mean that the government is going out there and telling everybody, well, hey, when you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, go out and get married. But then you would prefer if you had that type of support system. And even a lot of the studies that we have had done by religious organizations and social workers or movements, they're showing you that the chances are better. Even if you have two parents who are not married who live in the same household, the children have a better or a different or elevated sense of self. You have that balance, the gender balance in there, in terms of telling you, well, this is how you treat children. This is how a father is supposed to treat a child, or a mother is supposed to treat a child. But it also goes beyond that. It also calls for maybe shifting the approach that you have to parenting as your children grow up. Because, for example, the approach you had when they're toddlers, you're not going to have the same approach when they're teenagers and still let them do as they like. Because that is the time when you have your biggest challenges in front of you, because they're pending adulthood. And of course, waging hormones help that too. But at the same time, what we're finding is that you really need fathers to take a more concerted role in how little girls are raised, so that at the same time, you take your child out on a date. You take your daughter out on a date, take her to dinner. She could be 13, you're in your 40s or your 50s, it doesn't matter. You pull out the chair for her. You let her look at the list. I'm not telling you ask for a wine list, because here she's a child, okay? But you could have your glass of wine and let your child pick from the menu. And you expose your children to different types of cuisine. You teach them what it is to eat in a formal setting. And you know what that does, Miss McPhail? At the end of the day, when that little girl starts dating, she will be more discerning and by extension more discriminating, because she will know that my daddy raised me in such a way that he respects me and he thinks that I am precious, and basically the same thing he showed me is what I should be looking for in a boyfriend. So don't tell me that you want me to go out with you on the strip and that you're going to have sex with me in the back of your car and you figure you could chat about it with your friends tomorrow, and when I tell you I want to go out to eat, you pull me up in front of some bread and saltfish place and ask me what color person you want. Okay? You don't want that. I'm not saying that there is not opportunity for you to do that. Because you could be taking her out to dinner, you could wine and dine, and there might be occasions when you drive around the island and you pull up by a shop like that. It is part of your enculturation in appreciating what is there. But that can't be the end all and be all. But then a young man who has not been exposed to that, he can't teach your daughter that, he can't expose her to that. And by extension, if you have young men growing up in a situation where the mother has a different man in her bed every night, and they're beating her up because she got to put up with all these things to be able to feed you, and then he grows up with the same attitude that maybe I should put my hand on a woman. What do you expect going to happen? You repeat the cycle over and over again. So I'm not saying that the government is saying that everybody needs to go out and we're on a marriage advocacy mission, but we are saying that it helps. It certainly does help. Or if the parent, the father doesn't live there, at least you should still put in the same kind of time. Because as I indicated before, I am not a parent, but I believe it's more important to spend time with your child than to spend money on your child. It doesn't mean you don't have to spend money on your child, because they're your responsibility. As I said, they didn't ask to be here. But the quality time that you invest in your child will reap dividends later on. So that even when you're gone, they have those principles and the guidance embedded in them, that they themselves have everything in them already. So that when their turn comes to become a parent, they could say, well, I learned this from my mother. I learned this from my father. You know, including the whole approach to second chances, where you might have dropped out of school for a pregnancy, but then you still end up getting a degree by the time you're 34. It might mean that you and your child end up going to college together, but so what? To me, I find that is a great testimony for telling children about perseverance. I happen to have gone to college with a woman who went there when she was already in her 50s, and she carried her daughter who was 18 and her son who was my age at the time. And even though they are college students who will say, well, I don't want my mother in any college with me, but I looked at that example as a good one, because she led by example. It wasn't easy for her, but she did it. And then some children might say, well, I feel kind of self-conscious with my mother being here in college with me because I can't get to do as you like. Well, why should you feel like you're going to college to do as you like? You're going there to get a degree. And especially if you have a student loan to pay back, you better go ahead and pass with good grades to pay back the people their money. You know? So it's about keeping it real and showing children that the same standards you have for them, that you have for you too, and you lead by being your child's best role model. So that is what the approach of the Department of Social Services, especially Children's Services, is all about. In terms of letting children get the chances they need, but at the same time you empower parents to meet the needs of these children. And by extension, you empower families.
About the holistic development of each individual.
Exactly.
Okay, I want to step back a little bit. Earlier you spoke about your experience in the private sector. Many small businesses argue that a major part of the issue they face outside of raising capital is actually having access to a steady supply of projects and work for their businesses. What are your views on the government opening the market space, possibly by privatizing some areas of government operations to provide more jobs for small businesses?
Okay, well, I'll back up a bit before I answer that question. And I'm putting on my private sector hat now since you put me there. But essentially, I think before somebody decides to go into business, you have to sit down carefully and decide, honestly, and ask yourself, do I have what it takes to run a business? That's the first thing. Number two, the kind of business that I want to run, is it needed by the St. Kitts and Nevis market? That's the next question. And then the third question is, if it is needed and I have what it takes to run a business, can I expect that the goods and services that I expect to sell through this business are available locally? By extension, could I expect to find the staff that I need to run this business locally? Okay? Do I have the kinds of skills that I could put into this business? Next question. Are you the type of individual, and when you do your audit about whether or not you have what it takes to run a business, you should be also asking, are you also acknowledging that most small businesses take about 5 years to turn a profit the first time? And that you might find yourself going through a situation where you can't pay yourself a salary during that time, because you have to make a decision to pay the light bill, to pay the government their unincorporated business tax by the 15th of each month, and then your exemptions might be smaller, it might be larger, depending on whether you're selling goods or services. If you're selling goods, then your government exemption is higher, because they expect that a considerable portion of your income will go into replenishment of stock. When it comes to service providers, of course, your exemptions are much lower, because they expect that most of the work that you put into your business is creative power, so that your startup cost should be less. So these are some of the questions that I think we need to answer first. The second thing is the infrastructure, the market that you're operating in. I mentioned earlier about the legislative infrastructure for getting into business in terms of the Small Business Development Act. That act, and I would admonish any private sector person, especially a small business person, to go to government headquarters and get a copy of that. You probably have to pay a nominal fee to get it, but it is there. And it tells you those businesses that are entitled to receive fiscal incentives. By that I mean whether or not you would qualify to receive concessions like duty-free in terms of bringing in a vehicle, your equipment, your raw materials, like if you decided to start a manufacturing outfit, so that you know exactly what is allowed for you. One of the other areas we hope that eventually the legislation will be able to give us is concessionary rates for financing, for business financing. But that is going to be a hard sell, because generally your standard commercial banks are not in the habit of lending money to start-up businesses, especially those types of businesses that are considered novelty businesses, where you don't have a tried and true track record that said they're going to make money, because remember, it's other people's money you're asking the bank to lend you. And the bank has to be sure that at the end of the month you could pay back that loan, because it's other people's money they took to lend you. So if it's an experimental business, you're talking more about the area of venture capital. We do not have any venture capital firms as yet in St. Kitts and Nevis, and that calls for, perhaps to start it, maybe a group of business persons who have already made it to come together and find a pool of funds that you can put in, and then have business persons come to you with their business plan and tell you, making a case, why should I lend you money? So it's about the local version of Shark Tank, okay? So, but then my thing is, if it's the approach like Shark Tank on television, you shouldn't have a problem with that. Because if you are so in love with your business idea, that you are so sure in your gut that it is going to work, you shouldn't be afraid to tell people what you want to do and what your business vision is. You should be able to go in there and talk the talk about what you think that business can do, so that the venture capitalists would be able to write a check for you, because they want back their money to it when it's over. And at the end of it, they also might want to share in your business, which is another consideration, because some of us want people to spend money in your business, but they don't want to acknowledge that by you having a share in this person's business, by investing in it, maybe I'm entitled to 50% of your shares. And you tell yourself, Natty, when is me alone busting my tail in here? Well, no, you can't have your cake and eat it. So the other approach now, in terms of opportunities for privatization of certain government services, for the government, and by specific terms I mean this team unity government, for us to make a decision about privatization, I think what you really mean is outsourcing, like outsourcing certain government services. For that to happen, the government will have to be certain that the outsourcing of certain government functions and services will be better served by putting it in private sector hands. So that is the key determinant. Will it be better served by putting it in private sector hands? Because you can't just get up without thinking of the pros and cons and the consequences and say, well, I don't think government should continue. Let's say, for example, government procurement. Things like the CPU, Central Purchasing Unit, or another function in government. It could be like privatizing your ambulance service. When we've done that, what does this mean? Does this mean that private citizens who in the past could call and get an ambulance to come and take up a sick person and you don't pay a cent for it, that when you privatize this, you expect that the same ambulance is going to come for you and you don't pay for it? Of course not. You have to pay for it, because it's a private sector entity now. So it's about the cost that would accrue to the public if those services were privatized. That, I think, is the biggest determinant. And I think most governments, as they graduate, the US has done it, a lot of the G7 countries like the UK and others, and even in some larger CARICOM territories, they may outsource certain services because it is more economical for them to deal with that, to get rid of the burden of having to manage those services. But they would not make those decisions without carefully thinking of the consequences, because at the end of the day, what you don't want is to have government programs and services privatized to the point where they're out of reach of the normal man or woman who otherwise, before privatization, took it for granted that government was providing that for him or her. So I think that would be the biggest determinant.
Okay. Minister, you have raised a lot of issues, a lot of key issues this afternoon, and we do want to get the input from the public. I'm sure they're sitting by their phones waiting to call in. So just a brief reminder, the numbers to call in are 465-2555, or if you are overseas, you can call at 718-577-2916. That's 465-2555. 7 or 718-577-2916. So the lines are open and we are expecting your calls. If you just joined in, you are in tune to Working for You, the weekly radio program where the people of St. Kitts and Nevis are given the opportunity to interact with their government. The Team Unity government is for the people and of the people. And we have a caller on the air. Good afternoon, caller. Welcome to Working for You.
A pleasant good afternoon to your hostess.
Good afternoon.
And a pleasant good afternoon to you, Miss Wendy Fitz.
Good afternoon, sir.
Miss Fitz has sat here from the beginning of the show. And I've listened in awe and was spellbound by your oratory prowess. And that is no mean measure when I say that. You have impressed me as a person who worked, I think, as director of the CIC.
That is correct.
And when you got into government, in spite you was, I understood, if stand corrected, that you were reluctant in going there. But you ended up there. And let me tell you, I don't know. I don't know. You captivate me with the way you speak. Your speech is so fluent, so fluid. You seems like you're well researched. And my God, I think even the hostess of that program, you had spellbound. And you so much for that. You said a few things that touch nerve. For instance, you see this thing where child molestation and incest, and they could be squashed by either of the parents taking a bribe, because they call that a bribe.
Exactly.
Money. If I'm not going to court, they should introduce a law like they do in the Virgin Islands and the U.S. Once the case reach to that department, the CPA, no, it's out of the hands of the parents. Like compromising, no. That goes right down to the max. Because I could recall a case in St. Thomas where a stepfather molested a stepdaughter. And the judge didn't play with him, 25 years. 25 years. For some Dominica.
Okay.
I say all of that to say this. Some of the parents here, I mean, let me define that. Let me take back that. You have mothers and you have parents, in my humble opinion. And how I define mothers and parents, mothers are people who, because they're women, they could get a child by the normal means. But parenting is taking responsibility to raise that child. To me, that's another story. Now, you have children in this community in which we live, having children. And most of them, not all, but most of them might have grown up in single parents' home. And the home in which they're brought up may not be very conducive for child raising, because sometimes the language, the behavior of the mother and whatnot. And then they dress the children, the little girls from childhood, in a vague and, I must say, a woman-like manner, with this skimpy dress and stuff like that. And, I'm not taking, sometimes we're in town and mother say, bring your so-and-so here, to so-and-so Arabian, and things like that, Yeah. Sometimes you say, why you speak to the child like that? Why you pulling your hands like that? The child. If she walk with her, she can't walk with you. Your strides are much more than hers. And
Exactly.
And I say all of this to show you that parenting, I don't know if they don't understand, if they're not given an opportunity when they're pregnant to go to parental guidance course or whatever. I think more of that is needed. And let me say this before I end, because somebody else might want to get it. You have said a mouthful, and you know, when I hear you speak, I just get captivated and I can't move from the radio and listen to you. Yesterday, your presentation in Parliament was brief but concise. I mean, how better? Listen, this government can get a better lady on that side than you. I want to say congratulations and keep up the good works, my dear. God bless you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you, caller, for that contribution. Do we have another caller? Yes, we have another caller on the line. Good afternoon. Hi, good afternoon.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Good afternoon. Hi.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, we are hearing you.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, Jamila, and good afternoon to Minister Phipps.
Good afternoon.
I want to agree with the call. I just heard that the presentation was wonderful. One of the concerns I have of this new Team Unity government is their PR and getting the information out. I thought Minister Phipps did a really good job in explaining her ministry today. One of the reasons I call in, though, is a situation I've had personally, and I was just going through the manifesto, Team Unity manifesto, and I didn't see much specifically on my issue. I'm a young fella at 48 years old, and I can't get insurance in my country because of pre-existing situations. It was 2000 when I lost my insurance because I was technically dismissed from the government for political reasons. I am wondering, is there anything that your ministry, Minister Phipps, is going to do for people in my position? I'm certain it's not only me, but pre-existing medical conditions have prevented a lot of people for many years, not just in St. Kitts, all over, from having medical assistance in dealing with their problems.
Okay.
Now the United States have dealt with it in a certain way. I have still been told in my country by people who are in the know that we can't do it in St. Kitts. What is there going to be a challenge to that? And if it can, how it can be done? Those are the concerns I'd like to raise this afternoon. Thanks a lot for taking my question.
Okay, thank you, caller, for calling in. I'll give Senator Phipps an opportunity to respond to your concerns.
Okay, well, I will start with the first caller.
Okay.
Because he did raise a concern as to whether or not we should not be thinking about law revision as it relates to how we handle cases of child abuse and to get around the whole issue of preventing mothers, especially from taking bribes in order to keep the pedophiles out of jail. And that is something that is worthy of review, because I think if we don't do that, it becomes a source of continued frustration for the staff of social services and child protection, that you do all of this advocacy on behalf of children, and then the mothers are not at the court and so forth. But then the caller is correct. Whether or not the mother takes a bribe, and if that is the case, she should be charged. But at the same time, it has nothing to do with the crime that has been visited on this child, that the child enacts to have to happen to him or her. Okay? So this is something that we really need to be working towards, and I'm quite certain that within the department that is something that we will be addressing seriously, because we do have cases where it has happened in the past, but we need to close those loopholes. But then at the same time, we have to be very reliant on the support infrastructure provided us by the Special Victims Unit within the police force, because we can't bring charges against pedophiles or child molesters, but we have to depend on the appropriate government agency to do their part as well. So the prosecution strengthening has to be part of that process, in addition to the legislative strengthening. Now, the second caller, if I could recap based on my understanding of the question he posed. He spoke about the manifesto of Team Unity and in the context of insurance coverage. And I have to assume that he's referring to the promise made to the public of delivering universal health care coverage to persons across the length and breadth of the Federation. Why is that so? As it relates right now in the public sector, in government, insurance is provided to civil servants, and the official carrier for that is National Caribbean Insurance, which is part of the larger construct of the National Bank group of companies, which government is the primary stakeholder within. As it relates to that, and he by extension noted, the caller did, that he was dismissed. He did not divulge what reasons he was dismissed for, but then at the same time he indicated that once he left government, he found that he no longer had medical coverage, and the reason given is that he had a pre-existing medical condition. Now, I can't comment specifically to his situation because I will have to know more, but what I will say is that the government's program of coverage when it relates to insurance for its civil servants is such that even when you're no longer working for government, unless you have been dismissed for some serious reason, once you agree to pay the monthly premium, you will continue on the coverage. So that is, as I said, I don't know his particular circumstance. Because, for example, persons who may have retired, let's say you have 25 years in the civil service, but you started working when you were 20. It means that if you choose to retire after 25 years, by 45 years, you still have a lot of life left into you. And you also have the ability to work productively, maybe for another 20 or 30 years. So the option is yours, that you can continue paying the money on your own behalf, because before then you were paying a piece, government paying a piece, and that way you could have coverage. Now, there is nothing stopping that caller from seeking coverage within the private sector. But again, it depends on the policies of the insurance provider of health insurance. And he's right, in most cases some insurance companies will not carry new insured persons if you have pre-existing medical conditions. That is going to mean down the road that you're going to be exacting large pools of funds out of the fund itself, because remember how insurance works. It's a large pool of funds, and you determine the cost that you charge each customer based on the necessary risk that you expect to cover. So, for example, in our case in St. Kitts and Nevis, as I mentioned earlier, that our biggest health problems are with NCDs, the non-communicable diseases. When we do get going with the universal health coverage, it stands to reason that the biggest amount of claims that we're going to have would be related to conditions that arise from having an NCD, whether it is cancer, whether it's heart disease, cardiac issues, diabetes, and so forth. And that might mean anything from the cost of medication, the cost of an operation, the cost of chemotherapy or radiation, and depending on the severity of your condition, the cost will go up. As it relates right now, we have a situation in the government based on the data that would have been revealed as we went into the estimates program that has just ended. We had just 2 clients alone within the civil service alone, amounted separately for payouts of somewhere in the region of about $750,000 just for cancer care, and these are civil servants. Now remember that that pool of funds, which represents the entire private public sector's contribution, is going to impact on the rest of the available funds left in there for other persons like yourself who might not be tapping into the fund, thankfully, because you're in good health. But then it's going to impact on it. So what insurance companies normally do is what are called actuarial studies or assessments and projections, where they determine based on risk, because that is what insurance is, a calculated risk that you try to cover for as far as possible. But we don't live in a perfect world, where they want to make money, yes, but they want to have controlled risk so that they know that the amount they pay out would not bankrupt the owners of the insurance company. However, as we move closer to the presentation of universal health coverage, situations like the one the caller spoke about with having pre-existing conditions will certainly be a factor. And if we're providing it to the rank and file of the population, then these are things that we will have to account for based on the insurance provider and the packages that we work out. Because if somebody has a prevailing medical condition, so what? Most of us have prevailing medical conditions that we might not even know about, and you only discover it when you take my advice and you go see your doctor once a year. So in that case, are you saying that now that you discover you're hypertensive, some insurance company is going to say that you're not eligible? Well, that same insurance company needs to survive, and you can't survive by making any possible applicant and every possible applicant ineligible, because you still need their premiums that you're going to invest with the hope that you have a great return on investment, that when you finally have to make a payout for the insurance claim, that you still have a good cushion of funds to sit on and make sure you return a profit or dividends for the people who invest in your insurance company. So these are considerations, caller, that I wish to assure you that the Ministry of Health will be taken into consideration, because obviously if you have a prevailing condition, that's when you need medical coverage most, especially if you do not have the economic means to pay for it out of your pocket or to afford private medical insurance.
Okay, we have another caller on the line. Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi, you are live on Working For You.
Good afternoon, Daniela and Senator Fitz.
Good afternoon.
I'm very impressed with your discussion on the radio show thus far, and I'm very excited to see the service you will bring to things at NEVIS.
Okay.
Following up on the National Health Insurance Scheme, and you did outline some of the challenges in terms of cost and persons having conditions, and the fact that there are a lot of non-communicable diseases present in our nation. Has there been any thought of expanding the pool on a regional level, maybe with other OECS countries, so that to reduce the amount of persons that may be needing care versus those who are more healthy?
Mm-hmm. Well, the short answer would be not yet. And the reason I say not yet is that we have not gotten out of the park yet with our own program here in St. Kitts and Nevis. And I see where you're coming from in terms of having a larger base, a coverage base that you spread the risk, and by extension you hope that you keep premiums or payments low. As it is right now in the OECS, the country with the heaviest population is St. Lucia, which has in excess of 150,000 persons in their population. And of course, moving towards the single economic space that we have already signed on to in terms of the revised OECS treaty, the Treaty of Bastille. These are some of the things that we will be looking at down the road in terms of facilitating the movement of people across boundaries, because by extension we are in effect saying that there is nothing wrong with a St. Lucian or a Grenadian deciding to come to St. Kitts, so pursue employment, or if they get married to somebody else and you go and live there. And the same way you transfer your social security benefits, you should be able to do the same in terms of your health insurance coverage. And you're correct, caller, but we are not yet at that point. But that is more of a long-term objective as it relates to the leadership within the OECS. And it is something that, as I said, would facilitate the movement of persons between the territories, because even though we are saying at the end of the day you want St. Kitts and Nevis to be the best place to live and to work and to invest in, we also recognize that we are part and we are a signatory of an OECS economic union that tells our people they have the right to work and to live in any member state, even a country other than the one in which you were born. And by extension, we should have the comfort of being able to migrate our insurance coverage, social security, as is presently being sorted out right now. I think in some countries it has already been put in place, so that it makes that transition easier. And of course, there is strength in numbers, but we are still a very small sub-region within the CARICOM member space.
Okay, thank you. And I have a follow-up, more on a local level. Coming back to the non-communicable diseases and managing that, I know that I have heard some complaints, and even a relative of mine who has diabetes, which is one of those non-communicable diseases, and was getting here at the hospital, and the hospital didn't have the right nutrition for them to consume while they were admitted. For example, of course, if someone who has diabetes, they cannot eat food with a lot of rice and starch and salted meat, and that is the only food that was available. So what is the Ministry of Health going to do to provide better nutrition, to address non-communicable diseases, and even going down to school meals, making sure that the type of foods that are being provided and consumed, are more healthful, not processed, less salt, so on and so forth.
Okay. Well, to begin with, caller, I am surprised that you have identified this issue to me, Because to the best of my knowledge, there has always been a dietitian on staff at the Jane France Hospital, and by extension over in NEVIS at Alexandra. And what would normally or should happen upon admission to the hospital is that a dietary profile should be completed on the patient so that you know exactly what would be the limits and on the embargo list that the patient can or cannot have as part of their diet while they're in the hospital. I cannot understand why somebody who is a certified diabetic who is a patient in the hospital would be faced with eating starchy foods, or you also mentioned salty foods. The salty food would more be a problem for somebody who is hypertensive more so than somebody who is diabetic, because your issue as a diabetic is having difficulty processing sugars and making insulin. So that would be a different issue altogether. But it is something that I will be willing to look into. But as far as I am aware, the diet that a patient is on while at JNF and by extension Alexandra will be done or should be done based on the prevailing medical history that is available in the hospital for that particular patient. Perhaps there is an issue in terms of a communication breakdown. Perhaps it's a matter that these things might be on the patient's chart, but then the persons who are delivering the meals from room to room are not paying attention to the restriction, the dietary restrictions that might be in place on the patient's chart. In terms of the school meals program, of course, that is something that is always constantly being reviewed to make sure that the children are provided with nutritious meals, especially because some of our data is showing us that the most nutritious meal, or the one guaranteed meal that some of these children have every day, is the meal they get when they go to school. And these children, some of them because of need or maybe because of parental ignorance, spend their other 2 meals eating the starchy stuff, the cheap stuff, bread and cheese, bread and sausage, Vienna sausage. These are the things that we need to be probably taking more in terms of moderation, especially now that the WHO has put out its groundbreaking research findings that processed meats directly contribute to cancer. And by processed meats, they mean anything that has gone through the process of refinement, mechanically and otherwise, to which additives have been placed to preserve the life of food, things that might have nitrates or nitrites, or for want of a better term, salt extracts for preservative purposes. These are the things we want our people to move away from. But at the same time, you have to balance that against the convenience factor and what they think is the affordability factor. Because some parents might find it easier to just let a child eat bread and Vienna sausage rather than to find time to even make a small meal for that child. Maybe they don't have the time, and their answer is to give them bread and something else. Unfortunately, sometimes it's bread and a soda, not bread and some lemonade with piece of cheese or something like that. So I think basically our approach to healthcare in St. Kitts and Nevis is one where we should look at it as a continuing developing work. It's not perfect, but at the same time you hope that you deliver the kind of care that you, in your mind and in your heart, figure that the people of this country deserve. But at the same time, I will hasten to add that it isn't every single thing that the government can provide for its citizens, because we have to be reminded that government is operating to raise taxes, to bring goods and services to persons who are in need of it, and you could only do so insofar as your tax base allows you. St. Kitts and Nevis should not be compared to the US, because they have an abundance of people. Over 300 million people make up the United States market. They also have direct income tax. We have abolished direct income tax here in St. Kitts and Nevis since about 1980 or 1981. Yes, we do have other income taxes, such as what you pay or what is deducted out of your paycheck in the form of social services levy. But then it cannot be expected to be enough to meet all of the multiplicity of needs that persons will expect government to provide. And here is where we have a new model of development going forward that is already catching on even in first world countries, where you approach development not just in terms of what government provide for you through taxes, but what you can achieve in terms of bringing services to people by public and private sector partnership. And we have been able to do that here even in St. Kitts and Nevis. For example, we now have kidney dialysis available at JNF Hospital. We have it available in Nevis as well. And in our case, case here in St. Kitts and Nevis is a joint partnership with a firm out of the French West Indies, because we couldn't do it on our own. And these are the kinds of partnerships that we will have to have more of. We also have, and I might as well say it here, the ability to have in a very short number of weeks having an MRI done here in St. Kitts, and that again has been invested in by the private sector, and we're now in the negotiation phase with them in terms of getting the best prices for our people, so that you no longer have to fly out to Antigua or St. Martin to get an MRI.
Jamila, do I have time for another question?
No, I'm sorry, we are out of time, but
Okay, no problem.
okay, but we have another caller on the line. Good afternoon. Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to Working for You.
Yes, good afternoon, ladies.
Good afternoon.
This presentation sounds like what a parliament should be.
Okay.
Miss Fitz, let me say good afternoon to Mrs. DP
Okay.
and to Mr. SP. They know who they are.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, since you all are out of time, I will get to the point. Now, there are and there have been a lot of child molestation in the Federation of St. Kitts, and I assume in Nevis too. And I know of some of them. Some of them migrated and some around here still. And they, I think who are around here, they are a threat to our little children, boys and girls. Now, I would like to know if the department can trace down or track down anybody who molested with, sexually molested with children and run away. And if somebody here say, well, look, we ain't going to court, I'm going to pay you some money and lay down there. If that has been done, if the department can track down those people who commit that crime and bring them back here and have them face the Justice Department. So thanks for listening.
Okay, well, let me make sure I understand that caller correctly. He's assuming that the person has been able to successfully carry out a bribe to avoid prosecution, and that they have taken flight and left the Federation. That's what you're suggesting in your scenario?
Yes.
Well, I don't know if any such cases have happened. What I know are cases where the mothers get paid off and these men or whoever may have offended these children are still here. But then what should really happen is, regardless of whatever dealings and wheelings that the mother or whichever parent may have taken from the perpetrator, regardless of that happening, there should still be a case.
Right.
But then, unfortunately, it is not within the department's purview to bring that case. We have to rely on the Special Victims Unit to gather their evidence and bring that person to trial. And then you deal with the parent or the guardian who has taken the bribery as a separate case. That is what needs to happen.
Right, okay.
We are not yet at the point where we have graduated as a country, where even in the cases where people are certified as child sex offenders or whatever, to publish their names or anything like that. That is another area of concern that people have growing issues with. I know that exists in the US, where once you're a certified offender, your name gets published, and wherever you choose to go and live, the people who live in that community by law must be notified that they now have somebody who has served jail time for doing this type of thing. Granted, some of the offenders, because they figured they have served their time and paid their dues, feel offended and betrayed or disadvantaged going into certain communities, because it's as if you're walking around with a red letter on your chest or a bullseye, and they don't feel comfortable living in certain neighborhoods. But then that too is too bad for them. They should not have done it. But then by extension, it should serve as a deterrent to somebody else who has taken it upon himself or herself in a sick mind to basically violate somebody's child.
Right.
That you should not live a life of comfort. And then thankfully we are not like the US yet neither. Because in the US, when somebody gets sent to jail as a pedophile, it's practically a jail sentence, or a death sentence rather, because the prisoners have their own codes in the US jails, where when you come in as being somebody who has offended or molested a child, you don't survive in jail, because they have their own code of ethics in there, as crooked as they might be, in terms of being serious murderers or serial killers. They will get rid of you in there as a pedophile, because their prison code says you don't interfere with children because they are a separate class.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay?
All right.
I want to thank that caller for his contribution. We are okay, let's take the final call. Okay, good afternoon, caller. You are live on Working for You.
Thanks for your graciousness. By my voice print, the minister would know, this is Jefferson Wallace.
Oh, hello, Mr. Wallace.
I commend you for the great work you're doing.
Thank you.
And all that you are planning to do.
Okay.
There are 3 things I wanted to do, but the time is out. I noticed that I was at a function last week, and I proposed that they had 11 community centers. I was corrected that there are 15. I believe they're underutilized. As minister, please motivate them to utilize them as best they can to help our young people across this country. That's the first one. The second one, now that Zika is threatening us, there are a lot of culverts around. We as householders have a responsibility to clean these, clean our households and our surroundings. But there are culverts that are overgrown with bushes. And now that the rainy season is here, mosquitoes are breeding a lot in these culverts. And I think that if there is a crew or crews at the health department, they can help us. And the last thing, the pharmaceutical procurement thing for the OECS. In the past, individuals have complained that enough drugs are not at the health centers, at the pharmacy.
Right.
Sometimes you go there, and they have 2 or 3 that they're offering you. And individuals leave with them all push-ups.
Right.
Right? So if you can address those. I know the time is up, but please, I'm beseeching you, please come back.
Okay.
You've been so total in your education. And I'd like to hear you again. And I can hear you all day, all night. Please come back.
Okay, I will call you off site once this program is over to give you some answers to those 3 questions.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I might add that the caller who you just heard is somebody who has spent a long time as a career civil servant in the Ministry of Health, specifically as it related to the early days when St. Kitts and Nevis had just only begun to tackle the problems of HIV/AIDS. He has worked a lot in terms of health promotion and health education. So he knows what he's talking about.
Okay, Senator Wendy Phipps, I want to thank you, the Honorable Minister, Senator Wendy Phipps, for being our guest this afternoon. I was inspired, and from the callers, you know that persons who were listening were inspired as well. So I want to echo the sentiments of that last caller to invite you to come back again soon, soon to Working For You. I want to say to the listeners, thank you for listening to another edition of Working For You. I am Jamiela McPhail, sitting in for Lesroy Williams, who is on assignment.
And I am Wendy Phipps, Minister of State with responsibility for health, social services, community affairs, and gender affairs.
Please join us next week for another edition of Working For You.
Working For You. A weekly talk radio program which highlights developments of national interest and the activities of your St. Kitts Nevis government. Join host Lesroy Williams as he presents news, views, reports, and interviews about everything regarding the activities of the Team Unity government and the building of our communities and the development of St. Kitts Nevis. Tune in and call in to interact with your government and share your views regarding the upward forward development of your community and our beautiful Twin Island Federation. Working For You is weekly, every Wednesday live from 1:30 p.m. to 3 p.m. on ZIZ Radio, Win FM, and Sugar City FM with rebroadcast on participating stations. Working For You.